Funding for Behind the Headlines is provided by DHG and Advisors. DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Doctors, Guns, and Money with State Senator Mark Norris tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we have State Senator Mark Norris. Thank you for being here.
Great to be back. Thank you for having me.
And Bill Dree, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So let's start. The session has ended. As we tape it, it just ended, but as this shows, it's about a week old. It started with the Medicaid expansion and the doctors I mentioned at the top of the show. That did not go the way the governor wanted. I was up there the day, I just happened to be up there. He addressed Tennessee publishers the day it went down. He was a very defeated man. It came back up later in the session. It really got no traction. Why?
Because rather than Medicaid expansion, we really need to be looking at management of TennCare. That's a small piece, whether to take on the enrollment of, by the time that short session ended, I think they were up to 490,000 new enrollees. We need to look at the entire program. How are we managing the TennCare program we've got? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we're now spending about 32% of the state budget on TennCare. Under Phil Bredesen's administration, we cut 300,000 people from TennCare when it hit 30%. So we're about 2% past the tipping point on the program we've got.
And Medicaid enrollment is up. I think I looked up here. It's around a 15% increase in no small part because as Obamacare rolled out and the exchanges rolled out, many people who didn't know they were eligible suddenly realized they're eligible. Is that correct? So it's 189,000 people increase, I think, from 2013 to 2015. So that's part of that increase without taking the expansion money and so on, right?
Well, that's right. And so while on the one hand, the special session was called to look at expanding enrollment in insurance, maybe 490,000, 400,000 people. On the other hand, we're looking at maybe having to disenroll about the same number. That's before we even talk about the pending Supreme Court case, the King versus Burwell case. In other words, we're oversubscribed. We're over 30% of the state budget, which is beyond the initial tipping point. And in June, there's going to be a ruling that determines whether the subsidies that the federal government has been paying to Tennesseans to enroll were constitutional or not. Right. And if not, we may lose those. So we need a more comprehensive approach to this.
But do you feel the pressure? I mean, the state, the federal government warned the state and other states that haven't expanded Medicaid, excuse me, that the money that goes to hospitals to help pay for uninsured people, that money may well dry up over the next couple of years. And that's in no small part why the Tennessee Hospital Association has pushed heavily to get this, said that they would fill the gap between what the federal government was paying and what some states are paying. The hospital said, we'll fill that gap because we're going to lose these pools of money. I mean, don't you feel that pressure as well that for instance, the Med, I know it's Regional 1 now, but
sure.
The Med, they've talked about a disaster if there isn't some sort of replacement of that federal money. Mayor Luttrell came out and said, look, we'd be looking at a ridiculously high, I forgot the number, but the property tax increases. Yeah. I mean, that's a real concern, isn't it?
Right, but it's a real concern comprehensively, the entire program. So now we're talking about federal funds for otherwise uncompensated care. That's sort of a third pot of concern, if you will. And this is the situation that arose in Florida. Heard that Governor Rick Scott is threatening to sue the federal government if it's a gun to the head approach. Expand Medicaid or else we'll take away your uncompensated care. I'm not sure that's what the federal government's saying. I think the federal government may be saying the uncompensated care pool is going away whether you expand or not. And if that's the question, then it really is a whole different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Rather than Medicaid expansion, you're looking at how are you going to manage the system you've got. And so that has a lot to do with the underlying concern. That's why it wasn't well suited for a special session, of such short duration.
Let me go a couple more questions, and then I'll turn over the bill. Well, it's not that this is old news. I mean, this went down many months ago, but it is such. It keeps coming back up.
Yep.
It seems obvious that some sort of proposal will come up again next session. So I'm not trying to just dwell in the old news. There were, anyone would say, there were tremendous politics involved with voting against this as well, because so many people, a wave of legislators across the country, in the federal government, in state governments, ran against Obamacare. It was the rise of the Tea Party. There's a real Tea Party wing to your party, the Republicans. So there were a certain number of people who it seemed like it didn't matter what. It was associated with Obamacare, they were going to vote against it. Was that your, sense of it?
There's a certain segment, certain sector that was the case. So there's a group that was dead set against it under any circumstances. There was, I think, the lion's share of folks in my caucus committed to keep an open mind. And they did keep an open mind and would be willing to consider it. There is another group that is clearly for it. So they're the three groups. The largest, I think, is open-minded. The smallest, perhaps, are the few who got out in favor of it. And there's some, quite frankly, who want it to come to the floor not to vote for it, but to vote publicly against it and to make a demonstration of their opposition. So there are some politics, but there's also serious business, financial, budgeting considerations.
But you do see it coming back up?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Bill.
And that's kind of my question. Once King versus Burwell is decided, it sounds as if you're saying the legislature then has a reexamination of TennCare, not just the Medicaid expansion, but TennCare as a whole possibly gets overhauled.
That's essential, really is, and really TennCare is about care. Medicaid expansion is about insurance. There's a difference. We have people who are enrolled and are receiving health care under TennCare. I'm concerned about what happens if those roles need to be cut as they were under Phil Bredesen, because we're beyond 30% of the state budget as it is right now. Nobody's really been talking about that. That's because they've all been distracted over here with this idea of expanding further for a whole new population without regard to what happens to the population we've got.
Was the assumption, at least it was my assumption, that everybody thought the DSH payments, everybody here in Shelby County thought the DSH payments from the feds for the uncompensated care that comes at public hospitals and other private hospitals as well, that those DSH payments were going to stop no matter what.
But guess what? They've now been reinstituted in Washington, and that's good. Under new provisions, they've been restored to some extent. And so that's good news. Also, the rate of compensation of physicians has been set. That wasn't set before, and frankly, when we went into special session, we had a situation where a number of physicians said, we're not going to provide care anymore for this population. So there's a lot in the mix. It's a lot more than just, hey, let's expand Medicaid and pull down an extra $1 billion. That doesn't cut it.
So what I see kind of emerging from this is that gives this time to move on and advance after you all take a look at the Supreme Court's ruling in King versus Burwell.
Correct.
And then figure out where you are, not just in relation to the Medicaid expansion, but in relation to the TennCare population as a whole.
That's exactly right. How do we manage the population we've got before we look at expanding? What are the costs? What are the benefits?
Well, let's go to another issue that in some ways was is untouchable for a certain wing of the Republican caucus in Tennessee, which is Common Core. Common Core became kind of so associated with Obama, and Haslam said this is the same thing I saw him speak early in the session, where he said, look, I kind of give up not on the principles of Common Core, but the brand is so ruined that I can't fight about it anymore. Paraphrasing him, that we just can't fight about it anymore. There are going to be changes because it's just associated with the president that there are a whole lot of people in the Republican Party in Tennessee just don't like. So the compromise that was passed was, and I'm going to read from a kind of wrap up here, that the compromise that was passed allows Common Core, this is one person's take, a lobbyist up in Nashville's take, allows Common Core opponents to declare victory, but by effectively repealing Common Core, while giving Common Core supporters assurances that Tennessee will develop its own high standards, which may not differ greatly from Common Core at all. Is this the beauty or the horror of politics? I mean,
it's the reality of politics.
Okay.
But it's a little bit more than that, because the governor has put in place a laborious review committee, a whole system now to grind through these standards and to evaluate them. And then the legislation we passed this year actually adds another layer of review subsequent to that to make sure that these are really Tennessee standards. So you're going to be criticized no matter what for it's more than a name change. It really is substantially and substantively more.
Were you in favor? I don't even know where you stood on Common Core from. I mean, it's been kind of moving through the system. I mean, were you in favor and then initially and then see it sort of get polluted, for lack of a better word, with this kind of negativity? Or
well, the whole terminology of Common Core, I have always been in favor of higher standards, and the higher standards that we've put in place and begun to implement are paying big dividends. I mean, we're off the bottom now. We're coming up out of the being last in the nation or next to last, and we're into the 30% and everything. So that is working. But I was not in favor of the federal government hijacking our system and our standards, and co-sponsored legislation last year, which very few people paid attention to, but it really put a moratorium on the further implementation at that point, so that we could stop the loss and encourage the governor to put his review in place, and which led to this year's repeal. Some people say it rips out Common Core root and branch. That may be an overstatement, but it's certainly more than a name change.
Another thing a bill that didn't pass this year on the education front, vouchers. I don't know where your take was on that. There've been talk about a voucher program. Obviously, Tennessee has been a hotbed of what some would call innovation, some would call change, some would call disaster, whatever. I mean, the state, city, counties have seen tremendous change in education. Voucher seems like a logical next step on the surface, but yet it hasn't passed.
Right. It's a hard sell in the House of Representatives. We're trying to provide more options, particularly for those most in need. Why should young people and their families be sentenced to failure, in effect, based on their zip code kind of thing? I sponsored that legislation for 2 years of the last General Assembly for Governor Haslam, successfully passed it in the Senate. It's always had a hard way to go in the House. I learned this year that the House Majority Leader, my counterpart, who also carries the governor's legislation in the House, was sort of secretly opposed to vouchers during the 108th General Assembly, last year's General Assembly. Sort of a heck of a note, now you tell us. But this year he said he was supporting it for real. And it got a little bit further, but not far enough.
Yeah, Bill.
That kind of goes to an overarching issue, overarching question about the relationship between the two chambers. What is the state of that relationship? Because when Insure Tennessee went down in the special session, there was a lot of finger pointing in both chambers at the other chamber.
The relationship is good. It's strong. That was a rough go. I complimented my counterpart, Gerald McCormick, during our session end presser day before yesterday. The going got a lot better after special session, and it's healthy. I mean, that's what a bicameral legislature is about. This is not just talk on my part. The chambers differ in their approaches. What was disappointing to me was the lack of any meaningful position or any meaningful activity, despite sort of the facade of activity during the special session. Originally, the House had told me, and my marching orders through the Lieutenant Governor were to craft a resolution that would be a House joint resolution, meaning the House of Representatives would go first. So I worked for about a month to establish that protocol and to proceed, and I was open about it. I talked to my caucus, I talked to the press. Well, all of a sudden, without notice, they changed their mind. And that's frustrating, because then I had to go back and say, well, if we're not going to do it that way, then how shall we do it? Well, it turned out the Senate went first. Well, more than that, the Senate was the only body that really took any legislative action on the governor's proposal. It may have appeared otherwise, but in the special session, the House never even officially referred it to committee for action. It was just an open hearing sort of review sort of thing. And frankly, I think they hung their majority leader out to dry on it.
But is there, I'm sorry, Bill, but is there a problem, does that reflect a problem of a supermajority? That, from a certain point of view, the Republicans, they have the House, they have the Senate in overwhelming numbers, and they have the governorship. But are there fissures within that party? Forget the handful of Democrats are up there. Does this speak to some sort of disagreement between wings of the Republican Party in Tennessee?
Well, I'd say it reflects a lack of leadership in the House. That may stem from fear of factionalism. I don't know. But as for Lieutenant Governor Ramsey, he was very outspoken about keeping an open mind. He was encouraging in everything he said and did, and he was out front and up front. The Speaker of the House was really nowhere to be seen.
Okay.
I mean, if you look back at it, and that sort of fed the factionalism in the House of Representatives. It really was a do-nothing moment in the special session, a do-nothing moment in history. And yes, this is typical of any government where you get supermajorities. You're always going to have differences of opinion, and if not factionalism, different approaches. I have that in my own caucus. That's part of what I have to try and manage and represent every member in the Senate Republican caucus. So.
Okay, Bill.
But is the nature of the Speaker's majority that she works with, is it different, albeit simply by nature of the fact that it's a bigger chamber in terms of its membership?
Yeah, the numbers involved for the viewers, there are 99 members in total in the House of Representatives. I think some 78 Republicans, I may be off. And the Senate, by definition, is a third of that. We're 33 members, and I have 28 of those 33 in my caucus. So I'm their leader, and I have, several objectives, several masters to meet as we proceed. I have to represent my caucus. I have to represent the administration to the extent that the protocol dictates we carry their legislation. And then there's always myself and my own conscience. And in the case of Insure TN, the governor and I simply had differences as to how we thought it should be approached. And this is one of those examples. It was public. It's not the only time that I have declined to carry legislation for him, but there's a line beyond which I won't go.
And that sometimes that's happened in past sessions where the person who carries the legislation says,
Sure.
I mean, there are contingencies that are made specifically for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's move on to some other issues. I mentioned top of the show, guns. Guns, and again, we're taping this a week from when it airs.
Yeah.
The session has just ended. Guns and Parks. There were a lot of gun bills, but Guns and Parks passed.
Right.
It passed. At some point, there was an amendment on there that said, if we're going to have guns in parks, well, why can't we have guns in the legislative building in the Capitol?
Right.
Which was kind of an interesting political move, if nothing else.
Right.
But why? I don't know how to ask it. Critics would say, why would you want guns in parks with kids in playgrounds and families out having a picnic?
I didn't bring the statistics with me today, but something that wasn't articulated, it certainly wasn't covered, is that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation provided us with statistics from the last 4 years, I think, and that we have a crime problem, a growing crime problem in the parks, the number of assaults and the like, and for people who are not familiar with guns or they're uncomfortable with guns to begin with, no amount of discussion makes any of this sound logical because they're afraid of guns, and I respect that. I understand that. For folks who are familiar with guns and are permitted to carry or otherwise, competent, the notion that they have to go unarmed when they cross a certain line onto a greenway or a park, when they know that the criminals don't care what the law says, they're going armed and will use those arms to kill you or rape you or otherwise assault you, is totally illogical. And so we removed that for state parks several years ago and haven't had any problems. We respect the local control, but at the end of the day, local governments are subdivisions of the state. And so to be consistent and to not let the statistics grow and the crime grow in those green areas, it seemed logical to repeal it. I do not think the governor disagrees with that. I mean, I do not think the governor agrees with that. I think he disagrees with it.
But okay, so if that's, take your point, why not allow guns into the Capitol?
I was for it.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, there are bullet holes in the balustrade there, and the banister, and the
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because but where do you draw the line? If for people who are opposed to all these guns kind of going, where are the lines where you shouldn't have a gun? Will it just be that every session they kind of open more doors, the legislature opens more doors to places where people can carry? Is that what it feels like to you?
Apparently not.
Yeah.
Because the House of Representatives didn't agree
On
with
the
it.
Capitol.
Yeah. I think we'll see not only open carry but constitutional carry again. There's a difference. So I don't think the issue is going to go away.
Yeah.
And it's a dangerous world in which we live these
Yeah.
days, and it's not getting any better.
Just 5 minutes left to go through another kind of headline bill that was passed on restrictions on abortion. Those were important to get passed. Why? Yeah. What was passed? What was finally passed? The abortion restrictions?
Just in a phrase, informed consent, 48-hour waiting period, and a licensure requirement for certain facilities. Essentially, what we had years ago, before the Tennessee Supreme Court ruling that prompted the constitutional amendment, which was supported overwhelmingly by Tennesseans. So, life and death issues are difficult to wrestle with under any circumstances. These seem like reasonable precautions to have put in place. They're not prohibitory in any way.
Well, and I was going to say, so critics, again, I'm playing the role of critic today.
Yeah.
So critics would say, well, look, it's just one more step towards ending abortion in Tennessee. Supporters, there are people listening who would say, well, I sure hope so. But there are other people who are saying, look, that shouldn't happen. Is your sense that the legislature is going to keep putting more and more restrictions to the point where there is a de facto prohibition?
No.
You don't see that will within the legislature? Okay, Bill.
Will the law as passed make it more difficult for a woman to obtain an abortion?
We don't think so. We do not think it will make it more difficult to get an abortion. It makes it a more thoughtful process. I have met many women who were thankful for having had the opportunity to have someone, a medical professional, with whom to speak about the decision. Abortion on demand is not right. It's not where we want to be. There are health risks associated either way you go, and we think out of respect for women and the unborn that they need to be fully informed and have the time to make an appropriate decision. I know how controversial it is, but we're not into at least I'm not into the ultrasounds and the other suggestions that were made. Those didn't advance this year at all.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to guns in the parks to kind of get at this intersection of what you described as a need for consistency in gun carry laws with the other concept that local government should be able to make the call on these particular regulations. Are we going to see that come into play? Have we seen it come into play on other issues?
Well, we have in the area of hiring labor, wages, and that sort of thing. In order to avoid sort of a checkerboard approach across the state where business interests don't know, which county they've stepped into, what city has, minimum wage requirements or certain labor requirements at variance. We've tried to sort of homogenize all those so it's more like one-stop shopping from a commercial standpoint. And the difficulty with some of the gun laws is if they're inconsistent, what you effectively do at the end of the day is disarm those who are otherwise lawfully able to carry. In other words, if you carry and you want to go out for a walk at lunch and walk the green line or some other example, and you think, well, I'm going to do that today. I guess, what am I going to do? I guess I won't carry today. And you effectively disarm a whole lot of folks that way. So it's just a...
But are the circumstances from one community to another different? Are they legitimately different to the extent that one municipality should be able to say, no, we're doing this a different way?
I don't think so.
Let me, just a minute left here. There's a transportation project backlog, $6 billion, I think it's estimated. You all didn't get to it this year, but there's some talk about increasing the gas tax. Tennessee, a lot of people don't know, Tennessee doesn't borrow a whole lot of money for its projects.
We don't borrow any.
Yeah.
Pay as we go.
Is it time to change that?
We've got to look into transportation funding. A logical approach is to take about 2 years to do it. The chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, Jim Tracy, has suggested that he's going to begin a statewide road show. There's a lot of consciousness raising that's needed.
Yeah.
You know, people take a lot for granted in how we get our infrastructure, and it's been about 30 years, so it's time to look at it.
And the traffic, talking about cars, traffic, the traffic cameras were ended. Is that right?
No, they weren't ended. They were watered down.
Watered
Yeah,
down. Okay, so they'll still be around in some
around.
fashion
Yeah, very
or another. We could get into judicial selection, but I don't think we have enough time, which is why I didn't do lawyers, guns, and money at the top of the show.
You'll have to have me back so
just
we can
to
talk.
Yeah,
talk about...
it'll be our most watched show, but it is important, so I don't mean to. The last thing I want to ask you about the pension reform bill that you passed.
Yeah.
Municipalities such as Memphis need to get on track with funding their pensions. Are you happy with that bill? And from what you've been able to see, the direction Memphis is going, do you feel like they're going in the right direction?
I do. And Standard & Poor's in December issued a report about the strength of Tennessee's economy based in part on the reforms I passed.
Okay. Senator Norris, thank you very much. Bill Drees, thank you. Thank you. Join us again next week. Good night.
Funding for Behind the Headlines is provided by DHG and Advisors. DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.